Okay. Calling the meeting of the Moore County Board of Education to order. Is there a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing no opposed, the ayes have it. The agenda is adopted. At this point, we're going to move into member training. Let me simply say for the record that the member training is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Schwartz, it's required from time to time by North Carolina law. And in addition, it is part of the contract with the Schwartz Law Firm that they give us member training, a certain amount of member training. And so we are going to be complying with state law in that matter. So I'll give it over to Mr. Schwartz.
Okay, thank you very much. So, good afternoon. You are required to get 12 clock hours of training every 2 years. So this can be included in your 12 clock hours of training that you're required to get by law. In addition to that, you're required by law, by State Board of Education policy, to get training on how to conduct the superintendent's evaluation using the state board instrument. But the state board instrument is not required for you to do the superintendent's evaluation. But you have agreed to use it under the superintendent's contract. All right? So I'll try and hit all that. So first thing is that state law, surprisingly enough, does not require that you annually evaluate the superintendent. Okay? State law does require that you properly supervise the superintendent. All right? So there's no legal requirement in law for you to conduct an annual evaluation. All right? The State Board of Education has a policy, it's policy EVAL 020, and it's included in the materials that I handed out to you, the big handout. So if you turn to the 5th page in here, you'll see something that looks like this. It's policy EVAL 020, and that's a State Board of Education policy entitled North Carolina Superintendent Evaluation Process and Rubric for Superintendent Evaluation. So that is the policy, and it says that superintendents may be evaluated annually using the North Carolina Superintendent Evaluation Process. So again, it's discretionary, but while you may evaluate the superintendent annually under this policy, all superintendents and local school boards are required to complete approved state training on the rubric and evaluation process, which is what we're doing right now. Okay, so you're required to get the training. You may use the state process and you may evaluate the superintendent, but you at least have to get the training. So the training is required, but the specific evaluation instrument, that is the state instrument, is also not absolutely mandated. It is, however, strongly recommended. All right? So this is the policy that the state adopted back in 2010, and it sets forth, if you turn to the 2nd page of this policy, it sets forth the process that you follow. Now, in addition to this policy, this state board policy, if you look at the front page of this stack of handouts, you've got your local board policy, 8180, entitled Evaluation of Superintendent. And it requires, by your own policy, that you annually evaluate the superintendent and that you do so at a special called meeting for that purpose. So you devote a special called meeting to that purpose of evaluating the superintendent. And the idea behind that is that you're not squeezing it in the middle of an otherwise busy board meeting, or you're not doing it at the end of a meeting where you're all exhausted and cranky and tired of each other. That never happens. No. Because the superintendent doesn't want to be evaluated at that point in time. Okay. And your board policy says that it is to be completed by no later than June 30th of each year. Okay? So that's your deadline in board policy. I'll point out to you that there's a little wiggle on that. 81 80.1 says that the superintendent has full rights to raise questions and make appropriate explanations. So it's designed to be an interactive process. And then 81 80.2 says that the board shall include in the evaluation the superintendent's performance as related to goals developed by the superintendent and board and other legal requirements. So there's a goal-setting process that is incorporated into this as well, and the goals can be goals developed by the superintendent and the board and other legal requirements. We're gonna go over some of the goal-setting process in a bit. Now, the superintendent's contract calls for an annual evaluation to be done by the board by July 31st of each year, and please don't do it then, that's my birthday, of each year, beginning in 2023. That conflicts with policy 8180. I don't know why the contract was written that way, but it's different than what your policy says. Your policy says June 30th, superintendent's contract says by July 31st. If you do it by June 30th, it's certainly being done by July 31st. So I would suggest stick to your policy unless there's a reason, Tim, that you may know if there's a reason why that was written that way.
Other than wanting to make sure it's done on a yearly basis, that was
Okay.
really the motivation.
Okay. Well, your policy already provides for that. The superintendent's contract also provides for an annual written evaluation to be conducted using the North Carolina superintendent evaluation process. So even though that process is not required by state law or state board policy or your local board policy, you've agreed to use the state evaluation process for superintendents in the contract with Dr. Locklear. Okay? So lots of times in superintendent contracts, what we do is set forth the manner in which the evaluation will be done because it's not set forth in state law or even state board policy. So in Dr. Locklear's contract, it is set forth and established that you'll use this particular instrument. Okay? So we're gonna spend some time going over the instrument. And then the superintendent's contract says the board and superintendent shall meet annually by August 31st to identify the superintendent's annual performance goals. So the goal-setting process is the start of every year's evaluation. It starts with setting the goals because those become some of the parameters against which you evaluate the superintendent's performance later in the year. So you want to set the goals early in the year, and those are for the superintendent's performance, not necessarily the district's performance. Keep in mind in the goal-setting process, lots of times what boards want to do is tie certain goals into certain performance based on the data that you have, and you don't, by August 31st, you don't have the data dealing with school system performance. That usually comes out in a preliminary mode in September, and then you get state board approved performance data in October usually. The superintendent is required to initiate the evaluation process. So the way that this is set up is the superintendent, as the senior professional in the district, calls to your attention the need to conduct his evaluation and how to go about doing it. And then there's an annual self-assessment of the superintendent that comes towards the end of the school year, and Dr. Locklear will do a self-assessment using the state evaluation rubric, and then the board will consider the goals that were adopted at the beginning of the school year by August 31st, look at the self-evaluation, and then evaluate him. All right? So that's the way it's supposed to work. So now what I want to do is take a look at the different steps in the evaluation process. So I do want to call a couple of other, well, I'll get to that later on. Let's look at the steps in the evaluation process. And if you look at, go back to the state board policy, which is your 5th page in to these materials. And turn to the 2nd page of this. It deals with the process. And step 1 is the superintendent's self-assessment. And that, what that requires is that the superintendent tells the board, hey, it's time to evaluate me. And in preparation for that first discussion related to the evaluation, the superintendent does a self-assessment, using the rubric that's in these materials. And that becomes the basis for setting preliminary goals for the upcoming academic year as well. Second, there's a meeting. Step 2 is there's the meeting between the superintendent and the school board. And at this meeting, the superintendent will give the members of the board, this says, a complete set of materials guiding the evaluation process and an explanation of the process. And that's what we're doing today, okay? So we're kind of giving you that idea of how to go about doing that before the self-assessment is done. Now, when this was being piloted as a system, what they called for was for the superintendent to provide artifacts justifying everything that's in this evaluation process. And that got changed before they finally adopted this whole thing, because I worked with one of the pilot systems that did this, and there were literally 3 tables about this size that were piled about this high with materials, and they set up a month-long period where board members could come in and go through everything on those 3 tables. And that got to be nuts. So they did away with that as a requirement. And basically what they ended up instead was this. The superintendent and members of the board will agree on the conditions of the evaluation, including its scope, timeline, goals, evidence, and documentation necessary to demonstrate proficiency, potential consequences of poor performance, and potential benefits of accomplished or distinguished performance. So this rubric, we'll see, follows along the same sets of standards that we have in, not standards, the same sets of ratings that we have for all other employees of the school system. So it's not demonstrated or developing, proficient, accomplished, and then distinguished. All right? Not demonstrated is really not, you don't use that unless there's no evidence of anything. Okay, so it's really developing, which is you're not quite proficient. You're working your way up to proficient. Proficient is the acceptable standard of performance. Accomplished is obviously above that, and distinguished is the highest level you get. Okay? The superintendent will share with the board the results of the self-assessment and his plans for each area that need to be addressed in the coming year. And those areas may include items that may need improvement, as well as areas of strength that can be enhanced and expanded. All right, step 3 of this is you do a consolidated performance assessment. Now, sometimes what happens is the superintendent collects this information from the board members. Other times, it's facilitated with the board attorney. With the boards I work with in the past, what I do is I facilitate the evaluation process and collect the data from the board members. We go through and have an interactive process where you make your comments and your ratings. And the idea is that the board should try to come to a consensus rating on these rating scales that we're going to talk about in just a minute. And if you can't come to a consensus rating, you can always just go with the numbers. But the idea is that the board talks it through and you share information. And one of you may say, well, I remember when the superintendent did this, this, and this, and I really liked that. And somebody said, yeah, but remember when he did this? Yeah, well, that wasn't that good. And then you talk, and that's not going to happen here, but you talk it through a little bit, and you remind each other of different things, and you talk about what went into your rating and why you rated him as you did, and what your thoughts are for what needs to be done on that scale. So the idea is to try to come to a consensus rating. And then section 4 is the district school board rating of the superintendent, step 4. And that is when the members of the board independently rate the superintendent's performance and then meet to discuss that. That's what I'm sorry, just combined 3 and 4. And the consensus rating will be shared with the superintendent. Now, individual ratings may be shared, but that's not required in this evaluation process. Okay? So some boards I have, show the initials of the board members as their individual ratings. Others share the individual ratings themselves, the individual instruments themselves from each board member, and others just share the consensus rating. That is the final evaluation rating. And then you get to step 5, the final evaluation and goal setting, and that's where the superintendent and the board discuss the superintendent's progress toward achieving goals that have been established for the year and the level of performance that the ratings ended up with on the different standards that are documented in the first 4 steps. And that discussion includes both the superintendent's self-assessment, the consolidated assessment that the board reached, and the board's summary evaluation of the superintendent, all of which should have been prepared in advance of that meeting. So you'll have the meeting where you'll actually go through and do the ratings. If you want, I'll facilitate that with you. And then you have a subsequent meeting with the superintendent. Now, some boards just have the chairman meet with the superintendent and go over the consensus rating and share that information with the superintendent, and then have that back and forth with the superintendent. Your board policy, again, provides that the superintendent has full rights to raise questions and make appropriate explanations. That can be done throughout the evaluation process and upon receiving the evaluation as well. If you look at the bottom of the 3rd page of the state board policy, it's got a little chart that lays out the superintendent's responsibilities and the board's responsibilities. The board's responsibilities are to get training on the evaluation process, to review the superintendent's self-assessment and any artifacts, that is, any evidence that he presents in support of his performance or his self-assessment rating, then to complete the evaluation form, to identify strengths and also areas of improvement, and to make any recommendations for improvement, and to ensure the accuracy of information and that this is an accurate reflection of the superintendent's performance. So, and then finally, to participate in the evaluation discussions and guide the superintendent in establishing the goals for the upcoming year. That's the meeting that's supposed to take place by August 31st. Okay, the process by August 31st. So, the next thing that I want to do is go through the rubric for the superintendent's evaluation. And if you turn past the state board policy, you'll get to a page that looks like this, which is the North Carolina Superintendent Evaluation Process. Okay, so it's the first brightly colored page that you'll get to. All right, now this is what sometimes people refer to as the McCrell instrument. The McCrell is the company that developed this. This is the State Board of Education Superintendent Evaluation Process, and it goes on for quite some time. It's 48 pages long. We're not going to go through all 48 pages. All right. So the performance ratings that are included in here, if you I'm going to get to turn to numbered page 8, if you will. Okay, so get to numbered page 8. And what you have there is the rubric for evaluating the superintendents. Now, I'm going to pass out to you another version of this that begins with, it's got the cover page and begins with page 8, okay? This will be what you'll use to do your actual ratings when we get around to it. But if you look at this numbered page 8, this is the start of the evaluation system, and I want to talk about how this is set up, both in terms of the ratings and the standards and the elements and the indicators, all right? So if you look at the pink color at the top, that's a standard, all right? And so the superintendent's evaluation instrument has 7 standards, all right? Now, within each standard, there are elements. So if you look at 1A, you'll see district strategic plan. So that is the first element in standard 1. If you turn the page, you'll see leading change as B. That's the second element. And then C, distributive leadership at the bottom of page 9, and that's the third element. So you got standards and then elements. The standards are, you got 7 big standards, and then you've got elements within each standard that you do the ratings on. Now, for standard 1, for example, we've got strategic leadership. Superintendents create conditions that result in strategically reimaging the district vision, mission, and goals to ensure that every student graduates from high school globally competitive for work and post-secondary education and prepared for life in the 21st century. They create a climate of inquiry that challenges the continuity, the community to continually repurpose itself by building on the district's core values and beliefs about the preferred future and then developing a pathway to reach it. All right, so that's the standard. And then element A is the district's strategic plan, and it explains something about the district's strategic plan, which is the district's identity, its vision, mission, values, beliefs, and goals, is derived from the processes used to establish these attributes and the ways they're embodied in the life of the community. Now, in order to evaluate that, you look at the indicators. All right, you see the blue line across the page, which has developing, proficient, accomplished, distinguished, not demonstrated. Well, under developing, you'll see 5 boxes. All right, and under proficient, you'll see 5 boxes. And under accomplished, 4 boxes, and so on. So each one of those boxes is called an indicator. So you've got the standard, the elements, and the indicators. All right? The indicators are the things that you rate. So you look at the first box, okay? Develops and communicates a personal vision of a 21st century school district. Does the superintendent do that? If you think so, then you put a check in it. All right? And then you go to the next box, and you end up going down the columns first. So when you're doing this evaluation, you go down the columns first and rate each box. Just, it's a check or a not a check, okay? Then you go to the next column, and you go down each column that way. But you do them, all of the developing ones first, then you go to the proficient ones, then accomplished, distinguished. Now, if you turn to numbered page 6 in here, it'll show you that with the arrows at the bottom of page 6. Okay? It'll tell you go down the developing column, then go up to proficient, go down the proficient column, go up to accomplished, and so on. So that's the way you want to do the ratings when you get around to doing the ratings. Now,
Just one question.
Yeah.
You have to do, even if you think that he is distinguished, you still have to do the developing, proficient, and accomplished.
right,
Okay, all right,
because you can't get to distinguished until you've finished the other 3.
all right.
Okay, and I'll explain the scoring in a second to you. But the bottom line is, if you leave a box blank in any one column, then the rating for that element is the last completed column, where you had nothing but checks in that box. Okay? Last completed column with all checks, yes. So we'll get to that in just a second. So I want to talk about the performance ratings themselves. So developing is defined as, and this is back to the outline that I had. The superintendent demonstrated adequate growth towards achieving the standard during the period of performance, but did not demonstrate competence on that standard. So developing is one notch below proficient, and it's not demonstrating competence on the standard, on that element. Second, proficient is the superintendent demonstrated basic competence on the standard. Third is accomplished, and accomplished is the superintendent exceeded basic competence most of the time. And then distinguished is the superintendent consistently and significantly exceeded basic competence on the standard. Not demonstrated means the superintendent did not demonstrate competence or adequate growth toward achieving the standard. And if you use not demonstrated, you've got to explain yourself. You have to comment. Okay, you can't just say not demonstrated. You've got to comment on that. So that's why not demonstrated on this has a blank. It doesn't have any indicators. That's where you have to write out why you feel that the superintendent did not demonstrate competence or adequate growth toward achieving that standard. Okay? So you've got the standard, the elements, the indicators that you have to rate, and the rate and the descriptors. Descriptors and the indicators are the same thing. Now, when you're going through and doing this, the way you score this rubric is you go down each column, and then if you checked off everything on developing, okay, even if you didn't check off everything, you still go forward and rate all the columns, okay? And then for anything you didn't check off, the last completed column would be your rating for that particular element, okay? So if you checked off everything in developing, everything in proficient, and almost everything, but not everything in accomplished, then the rating would be what?
Proficient.
The last thing you
Yes.
checked off everything. If you checked off everything under developing, proficient, accomplished, and distinguished, the rating would be what?
Distinguished. Yeah.
If you missed one in accomplished, but you checked off everything in developing, proficient, everything but one in accomplished, and everything in distinguished, what would the rating be?
Proficient.
It would be proficient, exactly.
Yeah.
The last one that you checked off every box. But you still go through and continue checking off the boxes after you have missed a box in one column, because that gives the superintendent more information about the performance of any one of these indicators. Okay? Any one of these descriptors. All right. So that's how you score this. Now, I do want to call a couple of other things to your attention. In the second page of your handouts, and the third page of your handouts, you've got some other board policies. So in the third page, you've got board policy 8150.
Are we
Okay.
in a little sheet?
No, I'm sorry, in the big package, page 3. So the way this is set up is you've got the board, your local board policies, then you've got the state board policy, Eval 020, and then you've got the evaluation process. Okay? So in your local board policies, turn to the third page, and you've got board policy 8150, the job description of the superintendent. And I thought it would be helpful for you to have all of this in one place. So obviously, the job description of the superintendent is something that you should consider.
Oh, yeah.
Your local board policy.
Let me see that, Dr. Locklear. Oh, it's just back here, okay.
Third
Yeah,
page
all
of
right.
the big packet.
All right, I get it, right here, yeah.
Third non-numbered page.
Yeah, that's exactly, I was looking for the numbers.
That's what I was.
Yeah. So you got the job description of the superintendent in your board policy, and it lays out, the goal is to provide leadership in developing and maintaining the best possible educational programs and services, and the performance responsibilities. And so you've got 21 different performance responsibilities, and some of these come from state law, a lot of these come from state law, and are just being put in this policy, and others of them are board mandated. And then the terms of employment at the very bottom of this page, salary and length of employment to be agreed upon with the board. And then next page is performance to be evaluated annually by the board. So these are things to keep in mind, and you should review this policy before doing the evaluation, would be my recommendation. And then one page before that is the end result of the evaluation process, which is policy 8160, compensation and benefits of superintendent. See, Tim, I told you I'd get there. Just kidding. It says the superintendent shall receive such compensation and other benefits as agreed upon with the board. The board shall review annually the superintendent's compensation and benefits upon the event of its annual evaluation of the superintendent's performance. So by board policy, you annually review the superintendent's evaluation, conduct the superintendent's evaluation, and as part of that process, you review his compensation and benefits. And also usually agree upon whether you make a determination on whether to consider extending his contract. All right? So that's how this all comes together. And what you need to do is establish the process going forward, but you've pretty much done that in the superintendent's contract. and in the, and in your board policies. So you've established that, by agreement with him and his contract, that you're gonna use the state evaluation rubric, so that's done. And you, by board policy, say you're gonna conduct the evaluation by June 30th of each year, and under the superintendent's contract, set goals by August 31 of each year. Okay? So now, I wanna take you through a couple things here in the McCrell package, the larger McCrell package.
Let me ask a question on superintendent's compensation, because you're more familiar with that contract than I think any of us are. Does that contract contain, I can look it up, I suppose, does that contract contain step increases over the years, or is that just?
It does
Okay.
not.
So for instance, we have to consider each year whether to give him a raise similar to what the teachers may get or something like that, correct? Because that's not part of his contract.
Right, so in the superintendent's contract, hold on one second here.
I'll give you the layman's response, and then Mr. Swartz can give the attorney board counsel. I have rights to what the state pay is for superintendents, and then you as a board also give me a local supplement. The contract does, I answered wrong the other day when you asked me this.
Okay.
The contract does allow for the same percentage increase on the local supplement as a state pay raise might come from.
So it will automatically give the same pay raise to you in both the supplement and the base salary as the teachers get. Am I correct?
Not exactly. It's, the state budget from time to time may, have an increase in, how all employees are paid, including state superintendents in the state of North Carolina. That is a different salary scale than teacher salary scale. And so if they agree upon a certain percentage, just say it's the 3% increase in the next budget year, my contract would also give me a 3% increase in the local supplement that the board agreed to compensate me for. Now, Richard, you might want to answer that a little more detailed.
I think we're saying the same thing, yeah.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. So it's in different provisions of the contract, but the bottom line is the, the compensation is based on the state salary range. There's not a state salary schedule for superintendents. So in North Carolina, we used to have a state salary schedule for superintendents, but we don't anymore. Now it's a range, and the range is up to X dollars. And X changes usually annually, not always, but in the state budget. And there are 5 different salary ranges for superintendents. Superintendent 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in Roman numerals, and that's based on your enrollment in the school system, your average daily membership. So in Moore County, the size of Moore County schools, you've got more than 10,000 students, so that makes the range for superintendent 4, okay? So you would go up to X dollars for superintendent 4 in state funding, and what that means is, from the state, you can draw down whatever the top of the range is for superintendent 4. You don't have to, but everybody does, because that means you pay less local money, okay? So you can go to the top of the range for that, and Dr. Locklear's contract provides that he gets paid at the top of the range for superintendent 4, plus he gets a local supplement, and then it also provides that he gets other state salary supplements to which he's entitled by law. So for example, for a doctorate degree, you get $253 a month, okay, and that's state paid, okay, it doesn't cost you a penny. For longevity, he's entitled to longevity pay. So there are, in the state budget, the General Assembly increases those ranges, usually on a fairly regular basis, but they did go a period of time within the past 5 years where they didn't increase. So they'll increase that range, and then Dr. Locklear's contract also says whatever the percentage increase is for the range. So last year, for example, it was projected to be 3%. It ended up being 4.5% when it was all said and done. And so when the state went up 4.5% in the range for superintendents, then Dr. Locklear's contract says his total salary goes up by 4.5. So you also increase the local amount by that
Okay,
amount.
all right, that makes it much easier.
Okay? And then, every once in a while, the state will say, all central office employees get X dollars as a bonus. Just for the sake of jazz, say $1,000, okay? And then Dr. Locklear would be entitled to that as well, because that's a state paid bonus, okay? So, that's what's called for in the contract. Now, if you go back to the large page of handouts, the McCraw document, if you turn to page 24, little tiny 24 in the bottom left. Let me know when you're there. Everybody there?
Just go ahead.
Okay, you there, everybody?
Yep.
Okay, dog-ear that page, okay? This is an example of a completed rubric for evaluating the superintendent. So when you end up doing this, if you want an example, this would be a good place to start, okay? So you'll see this is standard one, element A, all right? And in this particular example, everything under developing got a check mark, okay? Everything under proficient got a check mark except for one, okay? Then they kept on going, and 3 out of 4 in accomplished got a check mark, and 2 out of 3 in distinguished got a check mark. So who wants to tell me what the rating would be for this element?
Developing.
It'd be developing,
Yeah.
right, okay. Because not everything in proficient is checked, even though most of the ratings in proficient, accomplished, and distinguished are checked. The rating is still developing, okay? Because that's the last completed column. All right? And if you turn to the next page, at the top of page 25, we've got element B. You'll see everything under developing is checked, everything under proficient is checked, everything under accomplished is checked, and 1 out of 2 in distinguished are checked. So what's the rating here?
Accomplished.
Accomplished, okay, good. All right, and then if you look down to C, what's the rating in C? Bottom of the page.
Proficient.
Proficient, exactly, okay? So now you've got developing for the first element, you've got accomplished for the second element, and you've got proficient for the third element. So the rating for standard one overall would be proficient. Okay? You've got, you go to the median rating, not the mean, but the median rating on these, okay? So, that's how it would be scored for each of the remaining standards and elements. I'm not gonna walk you through all of these, but if you turn to page 37, what you'll see is a sample completed superintendent summary evaluation worksheet. All right? And what we just went through, if you look down towards the bottom here, you see strategic leadership. Okay, so we just looked at the 3 elements of strategic leadership. The district strategic plan and the superintendent's rating was distinguished. I'm sorry, developing rather. The second one, leading change, it was accomplished. The third one, distributive leadership, was proficient. So the overall rating for that standard was proficient. Okay, you look to the median, all right? Now, there are a couple peculiarities in the superintendent evaluation instrument. One is, for example, on standard 2, there's only one element. So whatever the rating is on that element is the same rating as the standard, okay? Another one that is a little bit peculiar is in managerial leadership, there are 4 different elements, so it's possible to get a tie. All right, and if you get a tie, you go to the higher rating
Okay.
on this, okay? So it's kind of tie goes to the runner, tie goes to the superintendent, all right, on these. And same thing in external development leadership, you've only got 2. So you take the higher of the 2 ratings, the 2 elements that are rated there, all right? And that would be how the rating would go. The next page, page 38, is the tally of the board members. So this is convenient. It's got a 7-member board considered here, all right? And this is filling in just an example of what the different board members fill out here. So you had one, in standard 1, you had 1 whose overall rating was not demonstrated, 4 proficient, 2 accomplished. So the overall rating there is the median rating, which is you get to, the easiest way to do this is count up from the bottom, okay? And the median rating will be when you get to the fourth rating. So you go not demonstrated 1, then proficient, 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 that gets you to the 4th one. Still got 1 proficient left, so that'd be proficient for that one. For standard 2, the overall rating would be accomplished because you got 1 not demonstrated, 4 accomplished, 2 distinguished. Okay. For standard 3, again proficient with 2 not demonstrated and 5 proficient. For standard 4, not demonstrated 1, 3 developing, and 3 proficient. So the rating is, the median rating would be the 4th one from the bottom, which is developing, and so on. All right, so that's how that would be scored overall. And then at the end of the day, you get the median ratings in the right-hand column. So you start at the bottom with developing for standard 4. You've got 1 developing, then you've got proficient in standard 1, proficient in standard 3, and proficient in standard 7. So your overall rating is the median rating there, which is proficient, even though you've got 3 accomplished above that, okay? So you don't do the mean, you don't do an average, you go to the median rating, all right? And that is how you determine the overall rating for this superintendent would be proficient. Okay, so that would be the end result of this whole process would be a rating of proficient. Okay? All right, now I want to also point out a couple of other things to you. If you turn to page 39, you've got a sample of a superintendent goal-setting form. And you can use this goal-setting form, or you can adopt anything else you want for goal-setting. Some superintendents like to use this form, some superintendents don't like this form at all. Some superintendents create their own goal setting and then try to squeegee it in to this goal setting form.
Dr. Locklear, didn't you give us a set of goals? That's what I thought.
Yes, sir, and it follows some of the same design, but yes, sir, I did submit that in the fall, and then gave the board another copy about a month ago.
So we should be using his goals that he submitted as opposed to these goals here.
Oh, these goals are just a sample.
Okay, all right.
These are just a sample. So this is just a format and the form. So, these are not the goals that you would use. These are just, this is just an example of what you could use. Okay, but use Dr. Locklear's goals for sure.
Yeah,
Okay?
yeah, well, sure, for sure.
And those goals are aligned with the standards that Rich has been discussing and going over with you. That's in the goal sheet.
And then the last thing I want to point out to you is on page 41, there are, you see Appendix B, and this is old now, but it's still in effect. These are the North Carolina standards for superintendents that were adopted by the State Board of Education back in 2007. So before this instrument even existed, the State Board adopted standards for superintendents. These are standards you can take a look at. And what they do, if you turn to page 43, turn to page 43, what you'll see are the standards and the elements and then the different descriptors that are on the evaluation instrument. And then on page 43, you'll see a yellow box on the right-hand side. These are examples of artifacts that you might be looking for or look to in determining whether or not the superintendent has met any of these indicators that are under standard 1. And you've got the same thing for the rest of the standards, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, on this instrument. So be a good idea for you to dog-ear pages 41 and 43 as other places you can turn when you're doing these evaluations at your home and at your convenience. Okay. So, told you we'd be done in less than an hour, and we are. Anybody have any questions on any of this?
No, thank you.
It's extremely complex.
It's not as bad as it looks once you get into it and start dealing with it. It is a rigorous process.
Yeah.
It is definitely a rigorous process. One thing I will point out to you is also on page 22. There's a screw up in this state instrument, and I've told them about it, and they've never fixed it. But you'll see I've got a squiggly line through the median ratings. That's supposed to be a blank form, but they left it populated from the sample. It's on there. So that's the state document that's a mess there that still hasn't been fixed. So what you've got here, and I don't know if you want to, I can hand these out again later on, but what you've got here is the actual form that you will use, which is, it's the cover page of the McCrell document that I gave you, and it begins at page 8. And this is what you'll use for the evaluation.
So this is the actual one we will turn in.
Yes. Yep.
Thank you.
Now, let me ask you a question.
All right.
Because the scoring of this is so, I think it's complex, okay? Am I going to do that scoring, or is your office going to do that scoring?
Here's what I would suggest to you, and you can do this any way you want, is what I do with a lot of boards is you go home and you fill out just the check marks,
Right,
all right? And then, and you write comments in. There are space, I left that out, I'm sorry. At the end of every element,
Yeah.
there is a space for you to write comments,
right.
okay? And that's where you should feel free to write those comments. And then what I usually do in the meeting where you try to come up with a consensus evaluation is I meet with the board, we go through the evaluation, talk it out, arrive at consensus ratings, also arrive at a numerical rating based on compiling the scores, and compile the comments as well, and then put that together in a summary instrument, summary evaluation instrument to be approved by the board.
That's how we did it last year. I don't know if you remember.
Actually, I don't. So,
Yeah, and then the chair went to the superintendent and talked to the
So
superintendent.
that part I remember, that the chair went to the superintendent and talked to the superintendent. But the initial scoring of the documents, do we take these documents and turn them into your office? Or is that a way of doing it?
That's one way to do it, but I can pick them up at the meeting where we talk it through and then do the scoring there.
Okay, either way, whatever is easiest for you, but I don't want to score it wrongly. You know, I want to make sure that the scoring is accurate. You've got, you and your staff have a lot of experience with this.
Well, I think what we do too is we go through each one and we talk about it as a team of what we thought Dr. Locklear performed, how he performed. And then we do a combined rubric, or a combined grade.
Exactly,
And
yeah.
then that's what we give to him. And then his team will put all that together.
So your suggestion, Ms. Caldwell, is just we keep these and we go into our meeting with these and then we discuss it. Okay, I mean, that's acceptable too.
Then we kept one.
And you'll be surprised at, when you go through that meeting, lots of times board members will say something and somebody will say, you know what, I didn't think about that.
Yeah.
Or, you know, I had forgotten about that. And
Or the wording sometimes is weird and you're like,
yeah,
I
or
have no clue what that
interpreted it
means.
this-
Yeah.
I thought this meant this, and
Yeah.
you think it means that, and now I can see that. So
What
you'll have a lot of that sort of behavior going on in the board meeting.
So, I have a question. I think there's some confusion, and the confusion may be on my part. These are not the goals and objectives that this board set. These are just examples out of the manual, right?
These are tied to the state standards for superintendents. So they're not just examples out of the manual, they're tied to the state standards for superintendent performance. But in addition to that, you've got the goals that were set. So you evaluate based on all of that.
So we evaluate based upon these criteria plus the separate goals and objectives that we set.
Exactly.
And do we have the separate goals?
Yes.
He provided those. Dr., I'm
Yes.
sorry, go ahead.
Yes, ma'am. Sorry, Ms. Davis. And my plans are to do what I would call a summary assessment, a reflection on those goals, and get those to you, you know, at least a couple weeks ahead of when you're gonna be meeting. If we do set up a special meeting for the board, which board policy requires in June, I would have that assessment to you, really probably in a couple weeks. So you'd have almost a month or 3 weeks to really look at my goals, look at my self-reflection from my goals, the evidences that I'm sharing with you. I think it could be helpful as well to share with you a self-assessment of the stand. Now, I know that's done in the beginning, Rich, but I've also found in my practice that a self-assessment of the standards myself and sharing those with you and my own self-assessment may be helpful.
Right, so you should not start filling this out until you get from Dr. Locklear his self-assessment.
That's what I wanted to
Okay,
know.
so you get the self-assessment, and when he gives you the self-assessment, he'll also give you the goals. And
Okay.
then you use that as a starting point for doing your own evaluation.
And
I did have
Stacy-
a question, if I may. I'm sorry. I think Dr. Locklear just answered what I was thinking for us newer board members who perhaps haven't had an opportunity to witness a few of these things. Whenever you do your self-assessment, you're going to give us examples of how you have done this throughout a longer time than what we've been in office.
Yes,
correct?
ma'am. And I'll do a summary. And again, I'm not trying to, as I say, I'm not trying to write a novel, but I'm
Sure,
gonna
yeah.
give you as brief assessment as I can and information of my reflection. And as I shared with you before, there could be a goal or an action step that I initially had set for myself and for our team, and we just didn't do it. And I'll say, you know, did not initiate, and I'll talk about why. The other thing I would encourage you, if there's a question, if there's something that you have feedback or question or something you want me to consider and you want me to give you more evidence on, please get that feedback either through Mr. Levy or directly to me, and I'm happy to provide that.
And Stacy, and I guess this is a Bob question too, and you're saying that last year we as a group went through this 20-page assessment.
Yes.
As a group.
So I don't know if you remember, but we all kind of did our own self checks, and then we just kind of went with what we didn't check versus what we did check. And then we talked about why certain people did or didn't with Dr. Grimacy.
This was Dr. Grimacy.
Yeah,
This was
not
not
with
done
you.
with me as an
Yeah.
interim superintendent.
Yeah, this was with Dr. Bob.
Yeah.
And then, because it was easier to go with the non-checks versus the checks, because there was just more checks than there was. And then we all discussed as a team, and then we wrote down comments of what we wanted to say to Dr. Bob about what, how he was doing.
Yeah, I remember doing that
Yeah.
for the, I don't recall doing that for the state guidelines. I remember doing
No.
that for the local goals and objectives.
Yeah, now his was a little bit different, and, because you don't have to use this, correct?
We didn't,
No,
that's
you
my
don't.
point, is we've never, this is the first time we've used this.
Yeah, so he had it, but he did not want to mark anything as distinguished because he felt that there was always room to grow.
Yeah, yeah.
remember
look,
that.
look,
Yeah.
So here's in the past, and I'm not casting aspersions because this is optional, but in the past, we didn't use this, gosh, we didn't use this 12-page evaluation. We just used the locally, it was the same measurement objectives, but it was just the local goals. and
We used the
objectives.
rubric that went with this, but and then I did go through some of them, it is, because it is long. It
Right,
is
but
long.
we did, yeah, but we
But-
didn't
but-
use these state standards. We used the locally developed standards.
Yes, the rubric that,
okay. I
this
just
right
wanna
here,
make
that
sure I
little
wasn't
rubric that
losing.
we had.
I appreciate that because I was trying to
Yeah.
remember doing it, and I'm saying, no, we didn't seem to use that.
Well, we went over it, but it
Yeah.
wasn't like we went through all of the check marks because it was Dr. Bob had a different kind of format than what I think we're using at this time.
Right, and this is part of his contract to use
Yes, it
this.
is, yes.
Okay, all right.
Okay, I guess we got more. That's-
So next year, we may want to change that.
Yes, we may want to use our local goals
I'm open to any feedback.
They have an
For next
attention
year.
span issue.
because there are, this, to me, as I'm going over it, basically, is a lot of, well, I call it bureaucratic gobbledygook, which could be interpreted 15 different ways. But the goals that he set for himself, that you set for yourself, are specific.
Those what we want to pay attention to.
They are really on target.
Yeah.
And those are the ones that I'm most interested
Yeah,
in.
I think we all
as
are,
to
yeah.
evaluation.
Yeah, thank you, David, for clearing that up.
Okay,
Okay. There you go.
all right, so.
Hour of training time.
As I,
Yes,
at
recess.
this point, I'm going to go ahead and declare a recess till, what is it?
4 p.m.
4 PM. So we're going to do our closed session at Farm Life, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, all right, so I'll declare a recess until 4 PM.
At Sand Hills
which time
Farm
we
Life.
will go back to Farm Life, correct?
Yes,
We
sir.
will reconvene at Farm Life.
Yes, sir.
All right, sounds good.
Thank you.
Recess in order.